Okay, welcome back everyone. I have 9:13, so we will get started with the next presentation. So we have Matt and Steve. I see you've shared your screen, so excellent. All right, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'd like to thank Lexi and the other organizers of this workshop for inviting us to speak on the Climate Change Atlas. I'm co-hosting with Steve Matthews. My name is Matt Peters. I'm an ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. Steve, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah, thanks very much. So Steve Matthews, I'm Associate Professor, School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State, and I have a joint appointment with Northern Research Station with Matt in Delaware. It's great to be here.
And I think the previous presentation by Corey kind of reviewed a lot of the climate change and climate modeling projection research that has been done. So that'll kind of fold into this presentation nicely. We'll be speaking on modeling tree and bird habitat suitability under current and future conditions. This is an area of work that we've been involved in now for several decades, but has actually been going on since the late 1990s here at the U.S. Forest Service. And so our group does a lot of species distribution modeling in the eastern U.S. and our efforts are underway to kind of branch that out into the full conterminous United States. And so, let's see, species distribution models, also called habitat niche models, habitat suitability models, various other names in the literature. They're a way to offer information about potential and current future conditions on the landscape and where species may be found on the landscape, as well as where suitable habitat could be. Species are generally modeled either individually, like much of our work does, or jointly, like some of the other models like Landis. And so what they have is data going into the models. Models can be either process-based or more logistic in their development, or they can be more statistical based, like the ones that we've used, using algorithms to form relationships and then predict out either habitat suitability or some kind of occurrence, presence, absence, or abundance. And one of the nice things about these models, both the mechanistic models as well as the statistical models, is that you could provide scenarios, either altered current conditions. Is there going to be an increase in fire severity, increase in fire frequency, increase or decreases in drought conditions under current conditions, and how the models can then incorporate that, produce new habitat suitability or species distribution under those scenarios. But also, as Corey mentioned, climate's going to change, and so thinking about the future, we can incorporate information about current conditions as well as future conditions as well, and then predict that out, 30 years, 50 years to the end of the century, wherever those climate predictions have been developed for. However, whether they're process-based or statistical-based, species distribution models tend to be very coarse-scaled, anywhere from a 1 to 50 square kilometer grid cell. And so we're talking about very coarse resolution here, information on where species habitat and suitability would be present currently or even into the future. And so that's something to consider as a forest manager when you're using species distribution models, when you're trying to incorporate that information either for planning or decision making. What is that spatial resolution? What is the information these models are providing? And how does that information can be modified by the local knowledge that I have on the landscape, or even the inventory data that I have. So as I mentioned, that we use a statistical modeling approach, which uses a lot of correlative algorithms to relate conditions of where species are currently found and where they could be on the landscape based on environmental predictors. So this slide is just kind of showing there's many different algorithms when we talk about statistical habitat models. I've just listed a few here in alphabetical order, and then just the number of citations since 2019, just to kind of show the prevalence in the literature. And so there's clustering analysis, and within the Forest Service, Jennifer Costanza in the Southern Research Station, she has done some cluster analysis to predict habitat suitability using forest inventory data. So that would be an example of that type of modeling approach. The second one here is maximum entropy, or MaxEnt. It uses presence only data. And so if you only have information on presence, maybe rare species or endangered species, you might not know exactly where they're absent on the landscape. And so MaxEnt is a way to look at only presence data and predict their occupancy across the landscape. Another algorithm is nearest neighbor imputation. You can see that it's not widely used in the statistical habitat modeling kind of research, but there is an example within the Forest Service. So Ty Wilson within FIA has used nearest neighbor imputation to predict live tree basal area for all species collected by FIA. And so at a very fine resolution, 250 meters, using the MODIS satellite information to kind of look at where FIA data is collected and then predict that basal area of individual trees using nearest neighbor imputation. The next one is regression trees. And so that's kind of where our statistical modeling framework fits in, is we use random forest, which is an ensemble of regression trees. And you can see that there's almost 9,000 citations. And so it's one of the more prevalent and widely used statistical algorithms in the literature here, just under thin plate splines. And so that's the most used. And so that's not just for looking at habitat suitability. Thin plate splines is also used for climate prediction as well. And so these citations are not just factoring in habitat modeling, but it may be a way to develop environmental data and then predict habitat suitability. And so that may be why thin plate splines is higher cited algorithm there. But with any algorithm, you need data sources going into your model. And so obviously there's field-based data, for instance, like FIA or forest inventory analysis data, which is a systematic sampling of our nation's forests, not only where forest is found or where species are found, but also various demographic metrics that can be obtained from that data set. And so, the field-based data, you may think that it's very high accuracy, but as humans, there's always error that may creep in to any data set. And because we can't sample every forested landscape, every hectare of that to know where all these species are found, we often have to rely on these coarse sampling of our nation's forests. And so field-based data can be a major source of where that data gets to train our models, to then parameterize the models, and then predict under other future conditions or different landscapes. So taking a model that maybe is developed where we know species are found, and then predicting into places that we're not actually inventorying or sampling those forests, and see where that model can then say whether or not the habitat would be suitable. So then the next best data set would be remotely sensed data. And so whether it's airborne or spaceborne data, we can often expand the extent in which our data is incorporated into our models. And so remote sensing often covers large landscapes. Satellite data capture the globe fairly quickly. There is various return intervals. And so like MODIS, I believe, has an 8-day return interval. Landsat, roughly about 16 days. You can capture the same location in 2 periods. But then just depending on the different data sets, these are mostly grid-based. There may be less error in these because they're capturing the landscape in a systematic way and using the same sensor. However, they're also representing large chunks of the landscape. So MODIS at 250 meters, Landsat at 30 meters. As we aggregate this information into our models, we have to be mindful of what they actually represent. For example, like elevation data, we can get very fine scale, 1 meter resolution with LiDAR. But if we're not modeling at 1 meters, how do we aggregate that to a coarser resolution? And then what that means as our models incorporate that more coarse resolution data. And then so with field-based data and remote sensing data, we could always derive additional metrics, either through calculations or modeling additional metrics from those data sets. And so that can be helpful when we're thinking about what our species habitat suitability models require in terms of parameterization. Sometimes in terms of climate data, we might not have all the variables that we want, but because we have a minimum and maximum temperature, we can then calculate other indices from those. Or elevation, we might have just the elevation, but we want a topographic roughness index or a topographic wetness index. And so those can be calculated through other algorithms. And then so the other important aspect is modeling frameworks. And so as we model across landscapes, we're representing a point on the landscape, and so we're making that representative. And so often models take the landscape and stratify it into grids so that you have this uniform area which is representative of that landscape, whether it's a 30-meter pixel, a 1 kilometer pixel, and so on. And so you have your landscape that's stratified. It could be based on one or more of your environmental data. If you have 30-meter elevation data, you might use that to then stratify your other data sets. But it's also important to understand that all data is processed and then linked to that grid. And so what is the spatial resolution that's important? So, what are you modeling? Where are you modeling? Why and how? And so if you're modeling forest and you're in the prairie lands of the Midwest, there's a lot more agricultural land. And so your very fine resolution, 30-meter resolution data might not be very important for tree species because you're not capturing a lot of that forested land at 30 meters. And so you're predicting more agricultural land. And generally the why and how could help inform which of those statistical algorithms or even process-based models would be better suited for your research question. So I mentioned that there could be some limiting information, and so elevation data is available at 30 meters, even at 1 meter if you have LiDAR data. For our type of work in the climate change atlas, the forest inventory data is actually the limiting information. We have climate data at 800 meters resolution, elevation data at 90-meter resolution, but the actual forest inventory data, because it's sampling a random systematic sample, it roughly equates to about 1 inventory plot per 6,000 acres, or essentially 1 plot within 1 4-kilometer grid cell. And so that becomes in our limiting information when we start thinking about habitat suitability for tree species. So then we've looked at the density of FIA inventory plots and records and wanted to know, at what grain size maximizes this information. We certainly don't want to rely on just 1 inventory plot at such a coarse resolution. And so at 10 kilometers, we could see here on the left, these dark brown areas. We don't have any FIA plots. Those are mostly agricultural land, grassland, shrublands, very few trees. And so they don't meet the sampling criteria for FIA to sample them. FIA needs at least 10% of the inventory plot to be covered by forest before they can go out and sample those trees to know what trees are on the landscape. And so that these brown cells do not meet that requirement. These light tan cells range from anywhere from 1 FIA plot to 4 FIA plots within a 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell. And then so these green areas, you're increasing the number of FIA plots 5 to 8. There's some blue plots we could see in these 3 states here, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And that's mostly because these states have actually supplemented the FIA, the national FIA inventory with state inventory. And so they actually supplement FIA, they pay them to inventory additional forested lands, densify their plots. And so the number of plots in these states, Pennsylvania is also similar. It's much more than some of the other states, like Tennessee, North Carolina, and other forested states. And so another thing I'll note here is that at a 10 by 10 kilometer resolution, the Eastern United States, we would actually need to model, train, or predict our models to roughly 41,000 plots. And so computationally, that could be somewhat of a challenge, could be demanding on the amount of time it takes to run the models and then predict them, especially for a suite of tree species. And so one way we try to approach the limited information from FIA data is to look at a hybrid lattice approach. And so the standard approach, or what has historically been used, is using a modeling framework or a uniform grid, which doesn't always appropriately represent one or more variables. So in this instance, a 10 kilometer resolution, we know that it refines the resolution, but there's also places where there's a lot of information we don't know. So in the areas where there's brown cells in the agricultural lands, we don't have FIA inventory there. We see that there are some locations that are lighting up as having at least 1, maybe even 4 FIA plots. But there's still a lot of cells that we'd be predicting into that's not based on any training data. And so we looked at a solution here, and that is to use a lattice approach of multi-sized grid to then model that phenomenon. So this approach has been used in mostly oceanography research, where the ocean is very vast and large, and so there's not a lot of sampling that occurs in the ocean, but where sampling does occur, researchers could use a more finer resolution grid cell and then expand that grid cell where there's very fewer instruments observing phenomena. So this hybrid lattice approach has been used in the literature. And just to kind of ground you in some of these definitions, so a lattice is a network of regularly spaced sample points represented by an array. And so in computer science, an array is very different than a grid or matrix. And so a grid is a uniform network of regularly shaped shapes represented by a matrix. And so there's almost a spatial component where if you think about a 3 by 3 matrix, you're limited by 3 rows and 3 columns, where a lattice, that array can vary in size. And so there is, like I mentioned, some research to support this. And so in 1997, both Choi and Brimcombe developed an algorithm which recursively tessellates an area using squares and rectangles. And so essentially what you're doing is taking the landscape and iteratively sectioning off with grids, in nested grids, the landscape, so that you have these kind of nested sampling areas. And so also Stevens examined a sampling design using continuous information to control for spatial dispersion, variable spatial densities, and nested subsampling. So it has been published in the research, not very well cited, only 17 times for Soy and Brimcombe, and almost 300 for Stevens. And this is mainly to do with the way geographic information systems rely heavily on raster-based grids, or that uniform grid cells. But some of the algorithms that we're using, especially the random forest, the regression tree ensemble, doesn't necessarily need to have that spatial component to train or predict these models. And so we could take advantage of this hybrid lattice approach. So if we go back to our inventory data, So on the left here, we have a 10 by 10 uniform grid. It has 41,000 plus grid cells across the eastern US. And we could see that again, the number of plots within each cell varies from 0 to around 15. If we take a hybrid lattice and we have in the dark gray here, 20-kilometer resolution, which was the previous version of our species distribution models. And in the light gray here, we have our 10-kilometer model. We can actually densify our models so that where we have forested land on the landscape, we have a better representation of what species occur at those landscapes, as well as the environmental predictors going into our models. And so where we have fewer trees on the landscape, more agricultural land, more shrublands, we're able to expand the number of FIA plots to capture a much broader landscape. And then, so again, by using this hybrid lattice, we've almost reduced the number of, I guess, cells, plots that we have to then predict, train our models down from 41,000 to roughly 30,000. And so computationally, that could be more feasible in some instances, especially if you're conducting a model across large landscapes like the continuous US or across North America. So I'll start getting into some of the environmental data that is used in the climate change tree and bird atlas. And so our regression tree models use a suite of environmental predictor variables. We have climate coming from the PRISM and then the NASA NEXT DCP 30 data sets. These have a spatial resolution of 800 meters. In both instances, we're using 7 metrics of annual and seasonal climate indices, such as annual temperature, annual precipitation, precipitation in the growing season, so that's May through September, and then we combine the temperature and precipitation in an aridity index. We also incorporate elevation data into our models using the SRTM 30 data set. So the space shuttle missions that occurred in the early 2000s collected 900 or 90 meter resolution elevation data for North America. And we've developed 7 metrics describing terrain. So as I mentioned, you might only have elevation. And so from elevation, you can calculate things like aspect, slope, terrain roughness, and some other metrics that went into our species distribution models here. Another new data variable that's somewhat interesting is this, it kind of represents solar information. And so we have the day length coefficient of variation. And so you could think of that as in the southern United States, states like Alabama, Florida, Georgia, where because they're closer to the equator, don't experience various or large variations in the amount of sunlight during the day over the year, compared to states like Minnesota, Maine, where during the summer months, they have much more day length. And so that coefficient across the annual monthly variation of how much the day lengths vary is used, one, as a way to kind of parameterize our models based on how much solar radiation is occurring, but also as a spatial component to kind of account for spatial autocorrelation. And so where we have these latitudinal ranges in our models, this solar variable may be acting as a way to kind of control for latitude gradients. We also use the USDA NRCS gridded Surgo data set. And so this is a 10 meter resolution data set of the Surgo, which is also Surgo and StatsGo. So where Surgo data is not being collected, it kind of fills that in with StatsGo data at a coarser resolution, but then provides that information in a gridded data set at 10 meter resolution. So we incorporate 12 soil properties and 9 soil taxonomic orders into our models. And so that information, all these, the suite of 45 predictor variables gets fed into our regression tree ensemble model to then predict habitat suitability for individual trees. And so data processing can be a challenge. And so using geographic information systems or GIS to then process large data sets through either zonal statistics can help process gridded data using a tiling approach. We could also use regions to define fine scale data, maybe data is at less than 1 kilometer. But there's a lot of information, gigabytes of information that goes into our models once it gets processed. And so using computer software like Python scripting language helps to automate a lot of this information, a lot of the kind of tasks that need to be done to aggregate data, manipulate data, and then eventually prepare the data for the model training themselves. So then data aggregation could be done either through statistical summaries. We could also look at accuracy assessment of the information, automation, and it's also a repeatable process. And so as we gear up to expand our models, we have a kind of a framework for how the model was implemented, how it was trained, and how it was eventually produced. And so we can modify that, it's documented, and we rely on the R statistical algorithm software to compile some of the regional summaries and implement that random forest model. And so I mentioned earlier that Corey gave a good overview of the climate projections. And so again, just to kind of highlight that these are computer-based simulations using mathematical formulas to recreate the physical process. They're at very coarse resolutions, often 2 to 2.5 degrees of latitude and longitude. And so one degree of latitude is roughly about 111 kilometers. And so these are very coarse resolution models. They're often run on several computer clusters. And then just to highlight again that there are 61 models from 27 groups. And only some of these models have been downscaled to more regional, local scales that we could then use to think about habitat suitability modeling or local niche modeling of where trees and bird species are. And so we've incorporated some of that information into our models that has been downscaled. And so just to highlight again what the downscaling process looks like, you take these very coarse information roughly at 2 degrees latitude and longitude. Statistical techniques can be applied to them to estimate values at more finer scales, often 1/2 of a degree, which is roughly about 8 miles. And then there's several methods in practice, each have advantages and limitations, but then use the observations to then relate to broader trends. And so you might have, the climate projections at a very coarse resolution. The regional models might downscale them to something similar to this that then is allowed us to kind of predict at a much finer resolution for our habitat of trees. And so just to kind of look here, we have our mean annual temperature. These top values here are from PRISM. So it's an observation that's been interpolated at weather stations across a 800-meter grid cell. And this is for the period 1981 to 2010. That's the 30-year climate normal that we've used to model our current habitat suitability of tree species and birds. But then looking at different projections. And so Corey mentioned that, there are many different downscaled projections. And so we're using 3 climate models, the CCSM4, the GFDL CM3, and then the Hadley GEM2ES model, but then also looking at 2 emission scenarios. So these are the RCP 4.5 and 8.5 pathways. And this is the 30-year period at the end of the century, so 2070 to 2099. And we can see that each of these models and each of these scenarios kind of project or predict a different type of annual climate in the future. And so incorporating that into our models allows us to look at different scenarios, such as a warm, wet, a warm, dry, a hot, wet, a hot, dry scenario. And this allows then foresters to kind of use that information for planning to look at things like if I'm going to have more temperature, warmer temperatures, and fewer precipitation events, I'm going to have a hotter and drier climate. What does that mean for my forest? How do I need to plan for things like more frequent drought, more prolonged drought? And so this is just the mean annual precipitation. Again, we have PRISM, so the observed 800-meter data set, and then different climate scenarios and projections here that went into our models. And we could see, again, some of these models indicate, maybe this might be the average condition where the GFDL tends to be somewhat wetter in the south, where the Hadley model is somewhat drier. And so the Hadley under 8.5 might be a hotter and drier scenario. And so thinking about that in terms of what it means for forest habitat and individual tree species is important as we train our models. And so as I mentioned, so we're using a regression tree-based model. And so our model is termed Distrib. We're actually in version Distrib 2. It's a regression tree ensemble, which uses a suite of habitat. Suitable habitat is abundance or relative abundance. At each individual inventory plot, we account for the species dominance and importance through basal area and number of stems, and then relate that to other species on that inventory plot. We use the suite of 45 environmental predictor variables and then model abundance for individual tree species. And so the data goes in, a subsample is generated, and it gets fed into each of these nodes. And then each time within the regression tree, at each of these nodes, we're taking another subsample of actual records as well as the environmental data and then predicting that. We do this over thousands, hundreds of regression trees. And so we could then aggregate those predictions to get at more of a confidence interval, but also we're taking the average prediction there. So we have more confidence that all the models kind of predict that this habitat is suitable or not suitable for that tree species. And then based on the abundance that we might hope to see on the landscape. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Matthews now, and he's going to talk specifically about the Climate Change Tree Atlas. And Steve, I'll stop sharing.
All right, great. Thanks, Matt. I think that was a good overview of kind of where we are. So hopefully folks have an idea of what's kind of happening behind. Sorry, my screen is not working. Hold on, I apologize. All right, wait, are you seeing the wrong one? Right? Are you seeing the right one? I apologize.
The Climate Change Atlas.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks. So I'm just going to go on from here and pick up where Matt left off. I think what we wanted to do was to give you a sense for what was behind the scenes there as part of a tool and a statistical modeling kind of goal. And so now we want to jump into a little bit about what's within the Atlas. So basically, if we have time, we'll kind of do a tour of the Atlas, but we thought it was important to just give you a sense for what's in there. As Matt had mentioned, we're currently in the 4th version of the Climate Change Tree Atlas. So it gives you a sense for how this has evolved over the last couple of decades, right? We started with 80 species and predicting counties to moving to 134 tree species. We also have 147 bird species we can talk about as well. And you can see kind of where we are currently. The 2019 version was the most recent one. Kind of Matt was summarizing those. So basically what I want to do is we'll talk about the individual tree species outputs, because that's a ton of outputs, right, under all these different scenarios and predictions. But we also have another whole set of information of in addition to the individual species information, summarizing these for different regions. And so I think it's important to be able to go back and forth between, where is, sugar maple distribution, how is its habitat projected to change, what are the environmental variables influencing that? But also, what does it mean if you're in a certain spot, if you're in Kentucky, and how does that assemblage of tree species habitats potential to change? So we're going to talk some about the regional summaries as well, and these are summarized at various different various different units. And it looks like a lot at first, right? Because you'll get these tables with all these species. So our goal here is to walk through this a little bit in the next 20 minutes or so, to give you a sense for how do you interpret it, and hopefully how can it be used. So if you go to the tree atlas, and again, hopefully we'll have a chance to do that here at the end, you'll essentially can pick a species from those 125 trees, 147 birds, essentially, and we'll get a sense for the current conditions. So this map here is essentially just showing, oh, am I showing the, so I apologize. Am I doing the right thing, Matt, or is that not right?
I think that's right, Steve.
Okay, thanks. So basically, we'll come into a pull down menu, and you will essentially see the different ways we can have and look at. So the importance value, as it's either derived from the actual data from the forest inventory analysis data and summarized importance value, or the current modeled component. So this is showing the current model distribution for sugar maple across the eastern US under current conditions. And then with the drop-down menu, you can look at the average of different climate models in these different RCPs, as we've been talking about today, or you can look at the individual models as well. And we get a sense for how those habitats are projected to change, in this case, is towards the end of the century. So this is kind of the basic bare bones aspect of what we have. And again, if we are able to do a little tour of the atlas, we can see what else is within here, because you can look at each of those individual predictors that Matt was describing, as well as the different scenarios. So that's the basic of where current habitat is derived from the current conditions, and how those projected changes are to unfold under these different scenarios, right? And then we can also add additional information, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty around models, and some models are better able to capture distributions than others. Sugar maple is a decent one in terms of those. We have these other information because it's important to provide the additional life history characteristics for species. So for each of the tree species, we have also developed a tool that allows us to look at adaptability, both on response to biological responses as well as disturbance responses. So you can see a whole host of disturbances that can influence each of these species, and basically using Silvex North America and other resources, we have essentially quantified these components on a -3 to +3 scale. And we use these two pieces of information to come up with a way in which we can rank relative to all those 130 tree species, where they fit in those aspects. So for a species like sugar maple, some of its positive traits, right, would be, as we think about in response to climate change, it's shade tolerance, right, certainly being able to compete and maintain presence and in the forest understory, and as it comes to light, as well as its kind of broad abilities to use different habitats, right, which is very different from some other species. So we're trying to combine both the spatial modeling, spatial understanding of suitable habitat changes, as well as what are the life history traits for a species. So what this looks like, essentially, is we can take two extreme species. So a species like balsam fir or a species like red maple, right? We essentially are able to, relative to each other, each of its species, look at this distribution of how disturbance life history characteristics or biological life history characteristics plot along this axis. So a species like red maple has its highest potential adaptability under climate change, given all those positive life history traits. Whereas a species like balsam fir, right, we know it kind of is limited in terms of climatic zone, as well as pressures from insect pests and pathogens, right, has a relatively lower score. And so this gives us another piece of information as we consider how species may respond to climate change independent of those habitat suitability models, right? So it's relative, but it gives us a good way to think about those. The next component, right? So there's really essentially 3 components to the atlas. One, the habitat models of distrib. The others is these life history characteristics, adaptability. And the third one is just trying to understand this mismatch between how habitat is projected to change. This is the case for northern red oak under current distribution, end of century components, right? We know that a species like northern red oak is not going to be able to just show up in northern Maine, even though the habitat there is suitable. So this is another set of a tool that we have, which is a shift, which is essentially looking to quantify the colonization likelihood of trees over the next 100 years in terms of thinking about dispersal distance, thinking about long-tail dispersal components, and what is the likelihood of a species being able to have several generations over the next several decades and arrive at this location. So obviously it's going to look very different, right? When we add in this shift component, which is what we talk about, right? Which is essentially quantifying the colonization likelihood for an individual tree towards the end of the century. So essentially what, in a nutshell, what we're looking at is places that are darker blue, right, have this potential to be colonized by the end of the century. It's this combination of good suitable habitat towards the end of the century, as well as a close enough distance that the species has a chance of arriving there. Whereas places in the light blue, right, that becomes, yes, the habitat is suitable, but there's very little likelihood without assistance or those aspects that would be able to colonize. And as we get into the yellows, the habitat may be a little less suitable, right? And we're kind of moving along those edges. So it gives us a way to kind of build in this picture of where the species is currently, how those habitats are changing, what are the chances of the species being able to make it to these locations at a given time component. So we view these kind of 3 aspects as really 3 critical pieces to think about when it comes to land managers and others to be able to make informed decisions about the current conditions of forest trees, as well as thinking about planning under climate change. And so we worked with a lot of folks. I'm just highlighting one group, obviously, with Northern Institute of Applied Plant Sciences, because we've worked closely with them over the last several years, decades, right, to assist with their climate change response frameworks and ecosystem vulnerability assessments, right? Of how can we get these data into actual tools that are developed. So that's what's great about talking with you all today is because we really see lots of great ways in which these data have been used, and there's so many other ways that it can be used with creativity. So to get back to this idea of combined species outputs or regional summary tools, we have summarized all the species information into these 1x1 degree grid cells. In one way, it's interesting for us from the science side because it gives us a data set that allows us to look at all species across space. But also it provides a nice avenue to help engage public and managers to think about particular tree species within their areas, right? This is just a figure from one of the papers recently. And so what that looks like is essentially for each, for all these different kind of data summary aspects, we have kind of developed outputs that provide information, whether you're in a national forest. I'm showing an example for the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky here, whether you want to know about a particular state, national park, urban area, right? All these different ways in which we can begin to summarize the data and try to distill it down a bit here. So what this looks like, right, is if you were to pick like a state, right? What I'm just going to do now is pick Kentucky, just as an example, right? The first page you get, and again, and it's why it's important that we think about what we have, is just a understanding and a summary of what those data are, kind of breaking species out into major groups, thinking about abundances, thinking about how well we're able to capture individual models. So model reliability, it captures 5 different measures of statistical performance for each individual species model, thinking about overall change, right, of species projected to increase or decline about 20%, as well as providing some summary of the climate conditions, right? These are the climate variables going into models, but also informative at that local space. Obviously, there's so many more climate tools out there that we encourage you to use, but we wanted to provide some way, as you're getting a summary of the species, what are those relative changes of precipitation, temperature, and the variables that are going into the models. So basically, essentially for, a place like a state like Kentucky, there's 109 species kind of in this report. And we can get this distribution of species projected to decline, 36, 30 potential increase, right? That presents lots of different shifting around in habitats, as well as species that are projected to have new habitats within the region. So what this looks like, right? It looks like a lot, right? It looks a little overwhelming, but it's essentially a table that you can download and then go off and do additional work with, right? So we essentially, I'm just going to orient folks and walk them through a little bit, and hopefully again we'll have time to go back and look for it. The first thing we want to start with, right? We know what species are, right? But we also want to know what sort of confidence we have in the model, and how well has it performed in terms of capturing its current distribution. Right, so there's a kind of a high, medium, and low kind of characterization with that. So that's the first important thing, thinking about what species we're dealing with. The other important variable, right, that we often kind of immediately kind of draw folks' attentions to would be this idea of this relative abundance, this importance value aspect. So the summed FIA importance value, right? So we're thinking about what is that importance value across that window? So in this case, across if I was saying this was Kentucky, what is the summed importance value for white oak, right, across that region? And this is again kind of calibrated by the area aspect. So another important measure that gives us that relative abundance under current conditions based on actual FI data in the current modeled information, right? So that gives us, this is essentially ranked in this case by the summed FIA. The next aspect are those summaries of potential changes to climate change at the end of the century. Again, we're just showing in this table RCP 4.5 and 8.5 averages across those three different models of each one in there, and we can get a sense for, is there a potential, and we kind of break these down into categories, again, kind of summarized within our papers. But essentially this idea, as we get to small, a large, increase or decrease, small, large, is kind of this about 20% of the change of current importance value at the end of the century, right? So we can start to get this color coding of potential species. So species like yellow poplar, right, it's relatively abundant within the state, has a potential for large declines, right? Whereas a species like, mock-or-nut hickory, right, it's certainly abundant and present throughout the state. It has the potential for increases throughout the end of the century. So those are kind of the core summaries that we can get from there. It's always important to go back and actually look at the maps to really understand how this is playing out, because this is really essentially how it's informed. So for a species that's important, right, especially within Kentucky, we can think about importance of white oak, right? We can get a sense of its current habitat distribution within the state, right? This is just summarizing what's happening within Kentucky, right? We essentially have a relatively no real large change in overall habitat for the state under 8.5. Whereas American Beach, right, we certainly do have some declines, right, in habitat, right? These greens get lighter into the future kind of habitat components, and that would kind of correspond again to this potential for as we can see, American Beach, small declines kind of in habitat. So this is essentially how these tools are working, and it's important to understand where we are within the state or region that we're focusing on. The next aspect is this idea of adaptability, right? And that's really summarizing those life history traits. And thinking about if a species is relative, more adaptable, potentially less adaptable to climate change, right? And that's an important additional life history information that we can't capture within our models that we want to make sure is out there. And it's meant to be something that local users and local knowledge can be used to modulate and modify that. The third component is really this combination of the habitat suitability, how abundant the species currently is, what's the potential change in habitat, what's its adaptability, kind of all gets combined into this score of capability. Essentially, that's combining those two characteristics, right, to get us a sense for, is a species in a relatively poor position, right, as we think about under climate change, or is a species that has this combination of information that may indicate that it's a little more suited, or may gain towards the end of the century, right? So it's all important that we weigh all these aspects to it. And then the last piece, right, on these tables, right, for these regional summaries is bringing in this potential for species to move into an area, whether infill within its current range, maybe it's in a region but not very abundant or doesn't reach all the cells. What's the likelihood that it can colonize there? Or if it's other species, what is the likelihood that it may be able to migrate within that region over the next century? So just to show a quick example for that, right, would be for, again, thinking about Kentucky, I'm just pulling that one example, right? Currently, a species like Florida maple is not necessarily very abundant throughout the state, right? Maybe just barely touching in some of those areas, right? It has potential to migrate to the region, but relatively low given the distance, right, from its current range boundary. So that's kind of how those patterns works. We want to acknowledge it has suitable habitat, but its likelihood of arriving there is really challenging. And the way in which we kind of think about this is we want to encourage folks to dive into the data and not be intimidated by it. But there's always important aspects to consider. One is this idea of to think about the trees, right, as well as the forest communities present within there. We have another whole set of climate of analyses that focus on urban areas, right? So again, just referring back to the previous talk of thinking about climate analogs, right? With Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky, kind of climate analog into the future is more similar to something like Tulsa, Oklahoma. But we can actually then begin to compare those tree communities between those two cities in this case. And this idea of dissimilarity, as we get closer to one, the communities become very dissimilar. And right now, the Lexington, Kentucky and Tulsa, Oklahoma plant communities are quite dissimilar, right? They're 0.6, if that's on a 0 to 1 scale. So that gives us the ability to think about how much change as between those locations. It's also important to think about deciding on which area you're focused on, right? If you're focused in national forest planning, this idea of focusing on something like the Daniel Boone National Forest would be more appropriate than thinking about the whole state of Kentucky summary tables. In this case, if you were to do that and just focus on Daniel Boone, right, you would see the potential changes for white oak is a slightly habitat decline in that eastern geography of the state. So that's important, right, to have that kind of more tailored to those local areas. And really at the end of the day, and something we really like to stress is that these tables and the overall kind of climate change atlas really should be balanced with that local knowledge and understanding of what is happening on the landscape for those key impacts. So that's really kind of what we wanted to kind of cover. I am happy to also we can save it for later, or I could go to the atlas now. I know we're kind of at time, so I don't want to spend time doing that now. So I might just stop sharing my screen if that makes sense. But really, the way in which we kind of walk through the climate change tree atlas, right, is really kind of the steps we were going through there. And I think we'd be happy to demo, but I also want to be respectful of the time here. So with that, I'll say thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve and Matt. Thank you both so much.
So let me just kind of do this quickly, and someone will have to keep me honest here on the time. Oh, sorry, I still have the tool.
I'll let you know. We'll give it till about 10, 15, 10, 20,
okay,
something like that.
That sounds great. You are seeing my website right now, right? My screen, right? You're seeing it. Okay.
Yes.
So basically kind of the URL is there, kind of takes you to our landing page, right? Where we can look at both the tree atlas and the bird atlas. I will also note that there's a whole host of video tutorials over here that can kind of walk you through the specific ways in which the atlas is used. And Matt has also produced a user's guide that should be out relatively soon. That's another GTR to do that. But just for the tree atlas and the individual tree species page, you collect on that, right? You can pick any of this hundreds of species, right, through this drop-down menu if you know what you want. You can also type it in. You can type it in any other ways, right? If I went in white oak, you can do that and then go to it. We'll just go to white oak just for the fun of it, right? So basically, we kind of get to this component of kind of the screen captures I was showing. We have the current forest inventory analysis data, right? These are the data that go into the models, and you can see the different grid cells that Matt was mentioning. You can look at the current habitat modeled, right, of distribution of white oak, and obviously this model is pretty good, and so it captures that distribution fairly well, as we would expect. all the information about the predictors are also embedded within here, right? So if you're really interested in soil permeability, right, you can see that, and that's a variable that ranks third in terms of this model, in terms of for white oak, but also the current conditions for things like precipitation. So all the variables are kind of present within there. Looking then at the projected future, I'm going to go back to the current model of future habitat, right? I'm just going to do the average of the ECMs, and we'll pick RCP 8.5, right? And we can get a sense of how that habitat is projected to change. If we wanted to get that picture of the shift to the colonization likelihood, right, we can then click on that button, and that gives us this finer scale view. This is essentially at 1 kilometer of this combination of that suitable habitat and this colonization likelihood. One nice thing is that Lewis Iverson took the lead on this. Lewis retired a couple of years ago, but was really the founding brain behind the whole atlas. He actually went through and summarized and gave his interpretation of all 130 tree species that kind of combine all the information. So it's a really great way to have that. You can see the life history characteristics under adaptability, for different species, right? So obviously for spongy moth and oak wilt, right, there's going to be some pretty negatives for species like white oak. And then there's some other characteristics such as response to fire as a positive one, right? You can look at that figure if you want to get that specific component. So that's that combination, and that's an adaptability score. There's a whole host of other things I'm not going to have time to go through, but you can look at the summary change maps if you want to look the difference, as we were talking about the other tool, between current and future habitat. There's always a summary of the potential changes for individual components. And then if we just kind of think about the regional summaries, right, and we are interested in a particular region, I'm just going to go to a national forest summary, and you can pick whichever one you want. I don't really have one. I'm just gonna pick Allegheny because it's first, right? So obviously you can get a map for that region. You'll notice that there's a buffer around that region because we want to have enough information to provide good statistical summaries of those species, right? Then you can actually download an Excel file or a PDF, and it's essentially that species summary table that I was just going through. And so you have your summary map of the climate characteristics, as well as the characteristics of the components, right? You have those individual tables, right, where you can sort them based on these different components. So species like black cherry in the Allegheny National Forest, it's an important species, projected to have small declines, so it has this kind of fair capacity response to climate change overall, right? Again, that's that overall summary. There's definitions to all of these cells within it, but it's really this kind of back and forth between the tables, right, and the individual tree species that we hope folks will engage with and really use their local knowledge to help understand that, right? So we have species maybe more familiar in terms of the regions, but we can kind of walk through any of those components, right? This is a species that has projected huge increases in habitat, but we know that it's likely not able to make it. And that's all this gray area, right? It's those areas. It's very low habitat quality or decent habitat quality, but really no chance of making it. But it's really around the range periphery we think about the shift component. So that's the 5-minute summary. I'm happy to do it more. I mean, I will add that the bird atlas covers, it looks a little different, but it's a very similar kind of process, right, where we have future, current, predicted habitats and those characteristics. But the tree atlas is the one that's built out more so and really is the focus of today. So I'll stop with that. I hope I did that in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was fun. Thank you so much.